Emma was a young woman who had worked tirelessly to reach where she was today, a dreamer who had turned her passions into a reality. And now, as she drove her sleek Lamborghini through the winding streets of the city, she felt the rush of excitement that only a car like this could give her. She had always imagined herself behind the wheel of something extraordinary, but never thought it would be something so extravagant, so powerful. Today felt like a reward for all those late nights and early mornings spent building her business from the ground up. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she sped through the empty streets, feeling like she was on top of the world. The hum of the engine was music to her ears, the roar of the exhaust sending a thrill through her that no other car had ever done. Before she reached a quiet part of the city, a place where she often went to escape the noise of the world, she found an empty parking spot tucked neatly between two other vehicles, and with a sense of pride she parked the car, carefully checking the lines, making sure she didn't accidentally scrape the side mirrors against the curbs. Her fingers brushed over the dashboard lovingly before she opened the door. Stepping out into the crisp air, she felt a sense of accomplishment, a reminder that her hard work had paid off. She locked the doors and started walking towards the cafe across the street. When she heard the distant sound of a car approaching, she turned around, thinking nothing of it. But as the vehicle drew closer, she saw it was a police car slowly pulling into the lot. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight. She hadn't parked illegally, at least she didn't think so, and there were no signs around the area warning of any restrictions. She hadn't been here long enough for anyone to have noticed her, yet still she felt a knot form in her stomach as the police car came to a stop just behind her Lamborghini. The officer who stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense look on his face. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, and his uniform was pristine. The gleaming badge on his chest caught the sunlight as he walked over to her car without even greeting her. He glanced at her vehicle with an air of superiority before looking back at Emma. "You can't park here," he said, his tone clipped and firm. Emma blinked, confused by his sudden approach. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't see any signs or anything about restrictions. I'm just grabbing coffee. I'll be quick." The officer's gaze was cold as he scanned her up and down, his eyes lingering on the luxury car in front of him. "I'm afraid that's not how this works," he said, his voice growing colder. "I'm going to have to tow your car." Emma's stomach twisted in disbelief. "Wait, what?" she asked, the words barely leaving her lips. "You're not allowed to park here," the officer said, ignoring her protests. He motioned toward the tow truck that had pulled up behind him. Without waiting for her response, he opened his notebook and began writing down details of the incident. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. She had done nothing wrong. She had parked in a space that seemed to be just as legitimate as any other, but the officer didn't seem to care. His authority was absolute in his mind. She was just another person who had broken the rules, no matter how unfair it felt. Emma opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't have the energy to fight with him, or maybe she was just too stunned by the sudden turn of events. She could only watch as the tow truck driver began hooking her Lamborghini up with ropes. She couldn't believe it. She had dreamed of this car for years, and now it was being hauled away like some piece of junk. Emma stood there frozen, watching as the tow truck driver expertly lifted her Lamborghini off the ground. The sight of the sleek car being treated like an abandoned vehicle made her stomach twist and her chest tighten. Every part of her screamed to do something, anything, to stop this madness. But she couldn't bring herself to move. The officer was standing by with his arms crossed, watching her every move with a look of indifference on his face. "You can't do this," she finally said, her voice shaky but filled with disbelief. She could barely believe the words that were coming out of her mouth. It felt surreal, like she was watching a nightmare unfold in real time. The officer didn't even flinch. He glanced over at her, but there was no sign of sympathy or hesitation in his expression. He simply nodded toward the tow truck driver, who continued his work without a word of protest. She had to do something. This wasn't right. She reached for her phone in her bag to try to record the scene, but the officer was already one step ahead. He walked toward her as she fumbled with her phone and snatched it out of her hands. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice now laced with annoyance. "You can't record this," he added. "This is official police business." Emma's heart sank. She was speechless as he slipped the phone into his pocket and turned his back to her, continuing to watch the tow truck driver hook her car up with the cables. She had no idea how to respond, how to react. She felt helpless, trapped in a situation where she was being treated like a criminal for something she hadn't done. She tried to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall, but they burned behind her eyes. Everything she had worked for seemed to be slipping away in an instant. Everything she had built, her dream, her hard work, all of it was being taken from her just like that. She could hear the growl of the tow truck's engine as it slowly started to drive away, dragging her Lamborghini behind it. Emma stood motionless, her feet rooted to the ground, as if the very earth was trying to keep her from chasing after the car. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let him take it. But what could she do? She was just one person, and he was the law, right? He had the power, didn't he? But as she watched the car roll slowly away, the feeling of powerlessness turned into something else, something deeper, a flicker of anger that began to grow inside her. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to just stand there and let him take what was rightfully hers without a fight. Maybe she couldn't stop him now, but she would make sure the world knew what had happened. She would make sure everyone saw this injustice. Even if she had to make her voice heard on her own. She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking hands and snapped a quick picture of the officer as he stood there, his back to her, still watching the car disappear into the distance, as if it didn't matter. She didn't care if he saw her. She didn't care if he threatened her again. This was her life, her hard-earned dream, and she wasn't going to let it slip away quietly. She was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of man he was and what he had done. No one should ever have to feel the way she felt now, as if their rights meant nothing, as if they were just another target for someone with power to abuse. Emma took a deep breath and started to walk back toward her car, to where it had once been parked before it had been taken from her. She felt the weight of the moment settle in. She wasn't sure what was next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let this go. Emma couldn't just let this go. She knew that she had to do something to make sure this injustice didn't fade away into the background like so many others. Before it, she pulled her phone out again, this time to record a video. Her hands were still shaking, but she forced herself to hold the camera steady as she spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a fire beneath the surface. "This is Emma. I'm in downtown, and I just had my Lamborghini towed for no reason," the officer said. "I was in violation of a rule I never knew existed. I wasn't breaking any law. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But he still took my car, and he won't even listen to me." She paused for a moment, looking at the scene unfolding in front of her. The tow truck had already disappeared down the street, and now the officer was in his patrol car, sitting behind the wheel, as if nothing had happened. She felt the anger rise in her chest, and she kept recording. She couldn't stop now. She had to keep going. She wasn't the only one who had ever been wronged by someone in a position of power, and if she had to be the one to speak out for all of them, then so be it. She wasn't going to stay silent. She uploaded the video to every social media platform she could think of, tagging the local news outlets and using every hashtag she could find that might get attention. She had no idea how far this would go, but she had to try. The video went viral almost instantly. Within hours, her phone was flooded with messages from strangers expressing their outrage. Some even said they were in the same position and had faced similar treatment from law enforcement. Others offered to help spread her story. They all stood with her, and the weight of that support gave her strength. She didn't feel so alone anymore. She couldn't believe the number of people who cared, but there were also people who didn't understand, who accused her of being entitled or said she was overreacting. But Emma didn't care about them. They were nothing compared to the flood of messages she was getting from people who wanted to see justice done. And the more she read, the more she realized how much bigger this could become. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly or had their rights trampled on by those who were supposed to protect them. The next day, Emma woke up to find her phone buzzing, nonstop messages from her lawyer, the local news station, and even a few influencers who had picked up the story. The video had gone viral, and it wasn't just local anymore. It was everywhere. People from across the country were talking about it. Emma felt a surge of hope. The settlement offer came soon after her lawyer called her to say the city was offering to compensate her for the wrongful seizure of her car. The details weren't clear yet, but they were offering more than she had ever expected. She was stunned at first. Then a sense of relief washed over her, knowing that her fight hadn't been in vain. The news outlets were running stories now, and soon it wasn't just Emma's word against the officers, it was a public debate, and everyone was on her side. The story of the wrongful seizure spread quickly. The officer's name was being mentioned on air, and people started digging into his past. Some digging revealed a troubling history of complaints about his conduct. Many claimed he had abused his power before and had used his authority to intimidate others. Emma's heart sank as she realized that this wasn't the first time he had done something like this, and maybe it wouldn't be the last. But she wasn't going to let him get away with it anymore. She was going to make sure he was held accountable for his actions, even if it meant taking on the system itself. She wasn't afraid anymore. Emma couldn't believe how quickly everything was escalating. The support was overwhelming, and it felt like the entire world was rallying behind her. But with every new message and every article that ran, the weight of what was happening began to feel heavier. It wasn't just her Lamborghini that had been taken anymore. It was her dignity. It was her voice that had been ignored for so long. Now people were listening, and they were angry for her. They were outraged at the injustice, and they weren't going to let it slide just like that. But there was still something gnawing at her. She wasn't going to let it end with just a settlement or a slap on the wrist. She wanted more. She wanted justice. She wanted to make sure the officer who had treated her like a criminal without cause would never do this to anyone else again. And she was going to make sure the city knew that this wasn't an isolated incident. As the days passed, the investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct became more serious. Local news stations were digging into his history. His disciplinary records were pulled up, and there it was, evidence of multiple complaints about his behavior from previous encounters. The stories that had been swept under the rug for years were now coming to light, and the more they dug, the worse it looked. The officer had been known for using excessive force in some cases, and had a reputation for being particularly hard on young women and minorities. Emma felt a rush of vindication. As the story started to unfold, people were beginning to see just how deep the problem went. It wasn't just one bad day or one mistake. It was a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for too long. She wasn't just a victim now, she was a catalyst for change. The pressure started to mount on the department as public opinion shifted, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. Soon the department was forced to release a statement acknowledging the investigation and confirming that Officer Daniels was on administrative leave. Emma was following the developments closely, reading every article and every update she could find. And with each passing day, it became clearer to her that this wasn't just about her car. It was about a system that needed to be held accountable. And if her story could help change, that then she was ready to stand her ground. No matter what, she had already become the face of a movement, and she wasn't going to back down. But the officer still wasn't backing down either. He had become defensive, issuing statements through his lawyer that tried to paint the whole incident as a misunderstanding. He claimed Emma had been argumentative and refused to cooperate, that the officer had simply been doing his job the way he was trained to do. But Emma knew the truth, and so did everyone else who had seen the video. It was clear as day that the officer had abused his power, and there was no way to spin that into something acceptable. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in authority, and she was getting more determined by the day. The news continued to spread, and soon more people came forward with their own stories about Officer Daniels. They weren't all related to cars or parking violations. Some were about incidents that had happened years ago, but they all shared the same common thread. He had overstepped his boundaries. He had used his position to intimidate and control, and now the truth was out there, and people were listening. Emma's lawyer had been in constant contact with the city council, pushing for a resolution that would ensure accountability for the officer. The settlement money was on the table, but Emma knew it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that people in power couldn't act without consequences. She knew her fight wasn't over, but the momentum was on her side, and with each new story, the officer's grip on his position began to slip away bit by bit. Emma felt a rush of adrenaline. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The news kept coming, and Emma could barely keep up with it. Every time she opened her phone, another headline flashed across her screen about the investigation into Officer Daniels. More people were coming forward, sharing their own experiences with him. Some stories were eerily similar to hers, others were far worse, and each one seemed to add weight to the growing mountain of evidence against him. Emma felt a strange sense of relief mixed with anger. As she read the details of each new account, she knew she wasn't alone anymore, but at the same time it only made her more determined to make sure this didn't get swept under the rug like so many other stories of police misconduct. She couldn't let it end like that. She couldn't let Officer Daniels keep his badge or his power. After everything that had happened, soon after the flood of stories hit the news, the city began to take action. Emma was contacted by a representative from the city council. They wanted to meet with her. They said they were looking into the matter seriously and were working to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. She agreed to the meeting, but only on one condition: that they were ready to make real changes to how they handled cases like hers. She wasn't just looking for an apology or a check. She wanted to see real accountability. She wanted to know that this wouldn't happen to anyone else in the future. When the meeting finally happened, Emma sat across from the city officials in a small conference room, her lawyer by her side. She listened as they explained how they were investigating the department and how they were considering new policies on police accountability. They offered her a settlement check far larger than she had ever expected, but Emma didn't reach for it, not yet. Instead, she looked the officials in the eye and asked what they were going to do about the officer who had started all of this. She didn't want their money, she wanted action. She needed to know that they were willing to stand up to the system that allowed people like Officer Daniels to abuse their power and get away with it. For so long, the silence in the room felt heavy, like no one was ready to answer her questions. She could feel the tension rising in the air. But she didn't back down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. Finally, one of the officials spoke up, promising that they would take decisive action if the investigation confirmed the claims against him. Emma didn't trust them completely, but she knew it was a start, and a start was all she needed. She left the meeting that day with a feeling of determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she had already accomplished something huge just by getting this far. The settlement money was tempting, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, not yet. She didn't want to be bought off. She didn't want to be silenced by a check. She wanted the officer held accountable. She wanted him to lose his job. And she wanted the city to acknowledge that they had failed the people they were supposed to protect. She took the next step in her fight. The public pressure kept mounting. More petitions were signed, more people were joining the cause, and soon the story of Emma and Officer Daniels had become a nationwide conversation. No longer was this just a local issue. It was a conversation about the power dynamics between citizens and law enforcement. It was about holding people accountable for their actions and ensuring that those in positions of authority couldn't just get away with mistreating others. The city began to feel the heat, the pressure from the media, the protests from the public, and the continued support Emma was receiving from across the country. All pointed to one undeniable truth: they couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just a parking violation anymore. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with a broken system. And Emma was ready to make sure that something changed. She wasn't going to rest until Officer Daniels was held accountable, until the city made real changes that would protect everyone, not just the ones who were lucky enough to have the right connections or the right skin color. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. The investigation into Officer Daniels had taken on a life of its own. The public outcry had reached new heights as every new piece of information was released about the officer's past conduct. It was impossible for the city to ignore any longer. Even those who had been skeptical of Emma's story were now starting to question the officer's integrity. As more witnesses came forward with their own accounts of misconduct, Daniels' reputation was quickly unraveling. But it wasn't just his career on the line anymore, it was the entire department's credibility. Emma watched as the media began to focus on the deeper issue, the systemic abuse of power that was happening in local law enforcement. How many times had this kind of thing been allowed to slide? How many other people had been silenced or mistreated by officers like Daniels? And Emma realized that what had started as a personal fight over her Lamborghini had evolved into something much bigger. She wasn't just fighting for her car. She was fighting for the voices of those who had been ignored for too long. She wasn't alone anymore. The city's leadership felt the pressure mounting from every side. News outlets were demanding answers. Activists were organizing protests, and the public was demanding accountability in a way that the city had never seen before. And still the city tried to stall, tried to make it go away. They offered Emma the settlement again. But this time it wasn't about the money, it was about something much more important. She wasn't going to accept the offer until she had assurances that Daniels would face real consequences. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. She needed them to hear her and feel the weight of the movement she had become the face of. And when the city council finally announced their decision, Emma wasn't sure what to expect. They didn't disappoint, but it wasn't what she had hoped, for they said they were investigating Daniels. But in the meantime, he was being reassigned to desk duty. As if that would satisfy the public, Emma knew it wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. The very next day, she posted an open letter on social media calling out the city for their failure to act. She made it clear that nothing less than Daniels' termination would be acceptable. The letter went viral again. Thousands of people from all over the country chimed in, expressing their support and anger at the city's refusal to take a stand this time. Emma wasn't just some woman demanding justice. She was now a symbol of the fight against police corruption, the fight for fairness and equality. And the pressure on the city became even more intense. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, and the calls for Daniels' firing grew louder. Emma felt the tide turn in her favor. The more people spoke out, the more power she had to change the system. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged by an officer who used their badge as a weapon against those they were supposed to protect. And now she had the weight of an entire movement behind her, and she wasn't about to let that power go to waste. The investigation continued to unfold as more evidence came to light. Daniels' previous misconduct was being documented in full, and it seemed like the officer's fate was sealed. But the city still tried to stall. They kept saying they were gathering the facts, taking their time, as if the truth wasn't already staring them in the face. Emma wasn't having it. She knew they had all the information they needed now. It was time for them to do the right thing, so she didn't wait anymore. She pushed harder. She worked with local organizations to organize another round of protests. This time they were larger than ever, and the people weren't just protesting Daniels. They were protesting the system itself. They wanted a change, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Emma felt a surge of energy. As the protests grew stronger, more and more people joined the cause. Even those who had once doubted her now stood by her side, and together they raised their voices until the city had no choice but to listen. The pressure on the city was palpable, and Emma could feel it building with each passing day. The protests had grown even bigger, and the media coverage was nonstop. Every new development in the case seemed to spark even more outrage, and soon people from outside the city were joining in demanding justice. Emma felt a growing sense of power. She wasn't just an individual anymore. She was part of something much bigger, a force that couldn't be ignored. The city council finally called for a public meeting where they would address the situation, and it was clear from the way they were scrambling to organize it that they knew they were in trouble. Emma knew this was the moment. This was when everything would either change or when they would try to sweep it all under the rug. Once again, she wasn't going to let that happen. She showed up at the meeting with her lawyer and her supporters at her side. Her heart was racing, but there was no turning back now. She walked into the building with a sense of purpose. She wasn't afraid to speak out anymore, and she wasn't going to let them make her feel small just because they held power in the room. People were already gathered in the hallway waiting for the meeting to begin, and Emma couldn't help but notice how many faces she recognized from social media. Some were victims of police brutality, others were simply activists who had rallied behind her cause. The energy in the room was electric, but also tense. Everyone knew that the outcome of this meeting could change everything. Emma sat down in her seat next to her lawyer. As the meeting began, the mayor took the floor first and tried to address the public concerns with his usual political speech, full of empty promises and assurances that the investigation into Officer Daniels would be thorough. He spoke about the need for due process and how the city would work to ensure accountability. But Emma wasn't having it. She stood up from her seat, interrupting him, her voice clear and strong as she cut through his words with a demand for real action. She said it plainly, enough for everyone to hear, enough with the words, enough with the promises. All I want is one thing: for you to fire Officer Daniels and make sure this never happens to anyone else again." She paused, letting the room take in her words. She could see the shock in the mayor's face as he looked at her, but she didn't care. She wasn't going to let him talk around the issue anymore. She had worked too hard to let this moment slip away. When the mayor hesitated, Emma could feel the energy shift in the room. People began to stand up in support, their hands raised in solidarity, and a chant started to rise, "Fire him, fire him, fire him." Emma's pulse quickened as the chant grew louder and more powerful. It wasn't just her now. It was everyone, the collective voice of a city demanding accountability, and Emma felt an overwhelming sense of pride. In that moment, she was no longer fighting alone. This had become something unstoppable. And it wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about holding the system accountable and making sure the people who were supposed to protect and serve were held to the same standards as everyone else. The mayor's face darkened, but Emma wasn't about to back down. She stared him down with a look of determination that he couldn't ignore. He had no choice. Now the pressure was too great. The people had spoken, and he knew what he had to do. And finally, after what felt like an eternity of tension, the mayor spoke, his voice reluctant but resigned. He announced that Officer Daniels would be placed on indefinite leave pending the results of the investigation, and that disciplinary actions would be taken if the claims were confirmed. It wasn't the complete victory Emma had hoped for, but it was a step closer. It was clear that Daniels's career was hanging by a thread, and the city had finally been forced to confront the issue they had tried so desperately to avoid. And as the meeting ended, Emma walked out of the building, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She wasn't done yet, but she had just won a major battle in a fight that would define the rest of her life. The city's decision to place Officer Daniels on indefinite leave was only the beginning of a much larger journey. Emma knew this was just the first step, but the feeling of triumph that surged through her as she walked out of that meeting hall was undeniable. For the first time in weeks, she felt like the momentum had shifted in her favor. The crowd outside was still chanting for justice, and Emma's heart swelled with pride as she realized how far her story had come. It had become something bigger than she had ever imagined, a movement that transcended her individual fight for her car. It was about changing the system and giving a voice to those who had been silenced for so long. She had started out as just a woman wronged by an officer, and now she was leading a nationwide conversation about police accountability and reform. The weight of it all didn't hit her until she was back in her apartment. Later that night, she sat down on her couch, exhausted, but also exhilarated. She had poured everything into this fight, every ounce of energy, every ounce of determination. And now the world knew her name. Her phone was still buzzing with messages from journalists, activists, and even people who had been following her story from the very beginning. They were all congratulating her on the progress she had made. But Emma didn't feel done, not by a long shot. She was just getting started. The settlement offer was still on the table, and while she knew it was a substantial amount of money, Emma wasn't interested in just cashing out. She wanted real change. She wanted to make sure that her victory didn't stop at one officer's removal. She wanted to see lasting reform across the city and across the country. She wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug like they had with so many others. She called her lawyer and told them not to accept the settlement. She wasn't backing down. She didn't want to be bought off. She was determined to see this through. She wanted Daniels fired for good, and she wanted the department to change the way they handled complaints about their officers. Emma was getting calls from all over the country. Now people in other cities were reaching out to her, asking how they could take action, how they could organize protests, how they could stand up for justice in their own communities. She realized that her fight had sparked something much bigger than just her own story. It was a movement, a call to action for everyone who had ever been mistreated or abused by those in power. She couldn't let that opportunity slip away. She used her platform to amplify the voices of others who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement. And slowly but surely the conversation about police brutality and accountability was shifting in ways that it hadn't before. The city council tried to slow things down, offering more empty promises of reform and more stalling tactics. But Emma knew better now. She could see through their attempts to deflect attention. She pushed harder. She worked with activists to organize more protests and rallies to keep the pressure on the city and the department. Her phone was flooded with messages from people across the country who had been inspired by her story. They told her they had been fighting for justice for years, and now they felt like they weren't alone anymore. She had given them hope. And Emma knew that this fight was bigger than her. It was about every person who had ever been pushed down or ignored by the system. She couldn't stop now, not when so many others were counting on her, not when the entire movement was depending on her to stay strong and keep pushing for change. And then one day the call came. Emma was sitting at her kitchen table going through some paperwork when her lawyer called. She answered and heard the words she had been waiting for. Daniels had been fired after the full investigation confirmed all of the complaints against him, and the city had agreed to implement new policies for police oversight and accountability. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe it. She had done it. Officer Daniels was gone, and the city was finally taking steps to ensure something like this would never happen again. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, triumph, exhaustion, but also something deeper, a sense of purpose, because Emma knew that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, but today was a victory, one that she had fought for and earned with her own determination and the strength of everyone who had stood by her side. And as she looked out her window at the city that had tried to silence her, she knew one thing for sure: she was ready for whatever came next.